Chapter 13, beginning at verse 33, it says, and after this thing, Jeroboam returned not from his evil way. And it specifically talks about setting up priests in high places that were not Levites. Most of the Levites aligned with Judah where the temple was. So when they started worshiping the golden calf in Dan and Bethel, they fled to the south. So hopefully some of these Levites out of conviction wouldn't have any part of this. And it could have been that they just weren't available. But whatever, they're coming up with these priests that are not according to the law. Whoever he consecrated, he just set up these priests in their own areas. And the Bible talks throughout the first and second about in which he made Israel to sin. And that's a specific reference to setting up these priests that were not authorized by God and worshiping God through the golden calf. And so it basically says, because of this, God is going to destroy his dynasty. Yes?
And we also find out that there's always reference to either they're worse than Jeroboam or...
Yes. Yeah, that's true. That's true. You're not like David, who was the best, and you're either as bad as Jeroboam or worse than Jeroboam. In fact, one of the things I noticed when I was reading through this recently is you get this sense of progression of going from bad to worse. And it says, you've been worse and more evil than all the kings before you. And then the next generation, you've done worse than all the kings before you. Well, that means that everyone is going downhill quickly. And then the statement made about Ahab, it's going to basically indicate that he's the worst of them all. And if you ever read Moby Dick, who was one of the key characters in that famous novel, a fellow they named Ahab, who was just incensed to go after, he's the evil guy, so they named him Ahab. And so there's also a Bette Davis movie called Jezebel that was classic. And so these characters, when people were more familiar with the Bible, these characters resonated with folks. And when they wanted to talk about somebody being really bad, it's like you're like an Ahab. And probably the worst woman in all the Bible is Jezebel. And so we're going to talk more about her, and there's a fascinating character study that's involved in that. But at any rate, in 1 Kings 13, 33 and 34, it talks about the fact because of this that he's going to lose his dynasty. And then in 14, 7 through 11, Ahijah, the same one that came to him originally, Jeroboam, and told him, I'm going to give you the kingdom. God's going to give you 10 of the 12 tribes. And I gave you this kingdom as I promised, and yet you haven't done as David your father, haven't kept the commandments. Verse 9, but hast done evil above all that were before thee, and hast gone and made thee other gods, a reference to the golden calves, and molten images to provoke me to anger, and cast me behind thy back. It was just completely didn't care about what I told you to do. You're an apostate. Therefore, behold, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam, and will cut off from Jeroboam every man-child, him that is shut up, and him that is left at large in Israel. Will utterly sweep away the house of Jeroboam as a man sweepeth away dung till it all be gone. So that's the way God felt about Jeroboam and his wickedness. He was like dung that needed to be just swept away. Remember, in the north, it really doesn't matter who's reigning on the throne, because there isn't any specific covenant associated with any of the kings of the north. And so you're going to have one military coup after another, and God is going to rise up these people and each time hope that they will, finally do what's right after they're given the opportunity to serve as king. But one after another, they do not do that. And so it says in the 18th year, 1 Kings 15, of the year of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, began Abijam to reign over Judah, and 3 years reigned he in Jerusalem, and he walked in all the sins of his father, which had done before him. So you go back and forth between the kings of the north and the kings of the south, and everybody's compared to David, and hardly anyone really lines up. And then in 1 Kings 16, beginning at verse 1, and the word of Jehovah came to Jehu, against Baasha, saying, for as much as I exalted thee out of the dust and made thee prince over my people Israel, thou hast walked in the way of Jeroboam and hast made Israel to sin, which is another way of saying you continued in the golden calf worship at Dan and Bethel. To provoke me to anger with thy sins, behold, I will utterly sweep away Baasha and his house, and I will make thy house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. What happened to the house of Jeroboam? Totally wiped out, right? So Baasha doesn't last long. God wipes him out with this fellow Omri. And then it makes a comment about Omri, where he says the same thing, that he did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah, worse than any other kings around. Yeah, this is 1 Kings 16, it should be, 25 and 26. And Omri did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah and dealt wickedly above all that were before him. So he's even worse than Baasha and Jeroboam. For he walked in the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and his sins wherewith he made Israel to sin. So he was a successful king militarily, and he made alliances with Judah to stop the civil war, and an alliance with Phoenicia to maintain good trade, and set up the capital in Samaria. And so he made a lot of good moves, but he was wicked. He didn't last long. And then things are turned over to his son Ahab. Now, do you remember what we said about how they would usually set up alliances in the ancient world? What would you do? You'd intermarry, right? So who did Omri have his son Ahab marry? Yeah, Jezebel, who is the daughter of the king of Sidon. So this is a pagan Baal worshiper, and it was all done basically to set up all these, alliances that are going to help them in their economy. So with that in mind, let's look at Ahab, the northern apostasy epitomized. So the attitude of the nation, I think, is expressed in a pretty lengthy description of everything that's going on during the time of Ahab and Jezebel. So the people that are reading this after they're taken into captivity, and this is explaining to the people why really God had no choice and how many chances he gave them over and over again before finally he needed to take them into captivity and have them suffer the curses of the covenant of Deuteronomy 28, which he had told them earlier. So this is what we're looking at. This is the dynasty of Omri, and Ahab is going to reign for like 22 years, I think, and then his two sons, Ahaziah and Jehoram, until a fellow by the name of Jehu is going to wipe out the house of Ahab, and we're going to explain why that's the case. What was the incident that triggered God to send Elijah the prophet and to tell God to tell Ahab, you're going to lose your dynasty because of this? Yeah, it was the stealing, it was the murder of Naboth and the coveting of his vineyard. And so, what he did there was just awful. And the way he and Jezebel worked together in that is something we're going to look at tonight. So he's evil personified. Omri reigns 12 years. Ahab is going to reign 22 years. Most of the commentators you look at say that like Solomon inherited the glory of his father David, the building of the temple, David, killed Goliath, drove back the Philistines, secured the peace, but pretty much a man of blood all of his life. But then when Solomon steps in, he's the king of peace. Solomon means king of peace. And so he just inherits all this hard work that his father had done. So Solomon inherited the glory of his father David, and Ahab inherited the glory of his father Omri. But what is he best known for?
Being the most evil king in the
Yeah. By far, he's known for being the most wicked of all the northern kings. And when Manasseh is reigning for 55 years, and he is talked about being wicked, it says, you did even more wicked things than during the time of Ahab, and even more wicked than the Amorites. And we're going to look at a text where it's going to talk about that Ahab and Jezebel were more wicked than what the Amorite kings were. Now, why is that so significant? Why did the Israelites have to stay in Egypt for 400 plus years? Until what, according to Genesis 15:16? Yeah, until the wickedness of the Amorite was made full. See, these are national judgments. These aren't arbitrary. You just can't go in and take over a bunch of people and that'd be the right thing to do. But God is in charge of the rise and fall of nations, and he determined that the Amorites were so wicked that as a nation, they deserved to be completely wiped out. And so Israel is pictured as the Jehovah's holy army of hosts that goes in and is like carrying out this execution of this unbelievable wicked nation. And you look at the end of Leviticus and it talks about all the terrible abominations of the Amorites. And not only were they condemned for shedding innocent blood and for idolatry and for all types of sexual immorality, but even bestiality. I mean, that's unbelievable, scraping the bottom of the barrel. So God says, enough. And he also tells them that if you ever become like the Amorites and you ever commit the kinds of sins that the Amorites did, I'm going to vomit you out of the land because your sins have made me so sick, just like I vomited the Amorites out before you. And so when it makes reference to Ahab going back to being more wicked than any king of the north, and even worse than the Canaanites, I mean, that is really bad. And so if you're reading this and you see all these warnings that God has given, it helps you to realize how long-suffering God really was, and to put up with this for hundreds of years and give them chance after chance after chance. And they just will not stop, especially the golden calf worship. They're going to be able to successfully get rid of the Baal worship, but not the golden calf worship. And so this is kind of a key verse here, studying Ahab. 1 Kings 21:25, just a summary statement. No one else so completely sold himself to what was evil in the Lord's sight as Ahab did under the influence of his wife Jezebel. So Ahab was bad, but Jezebel was there sort of, nagging him and kind of, twisting the knife, so to speak, to get him to follow her evil desires also. Yes?
I have a note that said that Jezebel had something similar to power of attorney, so she could use his seal for anything she wanted.
Yes. Well, in fact, that seal is going to be used for her to carry out her nefarious scheme to get Naboth killed so she could get the vineyard for him. And Ahab doesn't really want to ask any questions about that. He knows she's up to no good. He allows her to use his seal. He's the king. So he's not willing to do the deed, but he's a coward in a sense and a hypocrite, and is willing to let Jezebel go behind the scenes and get him what he wants. And so there's another statement about this in 1 Kings 16, 29 through 33. It says, and in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Ahab, the son of Omri, to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah above all that were before him. So here we have another king again who's just doing unbelievable wickedness. And, be careful whom you allow into the sanctuary of your soul. I'm glad that they were able to find peace and have this trade alliance with Phoenicia, but it was not worth it, and it was not the right thing to do. And then Ahab and Jezebel are going to have a daughter. Anybody know who that is? Athaliah, who is going to cause unbelievable havoc in Judah, because Jehoshaphat is going to allow his son Joram to marry Athaliah. And boy, that's a dark chapter in Judah's history. And, be careful who you marry, and make sure you marry somebody that is spiritually minded and that will help you get to heaven, and not be there Like Delilah was Samson, and like Jezebel was Ahab, instead of encouraging you to do the right thing, they're encouraging you to do the wrong thing. Some of the commentators I've read on this have said that in general, all other things being equal, women are generally more spiritually minded and more good-hearted on average than most men. In most churches, you have a majority of women. And a lot of times you'll have a woman that's faithful and her husband's not. Now, sometimes you have the reverse, but my experience over 45 years of preaching is it's almost always the issue more with the man in his spirituality. However, if the woman is bad, she's really bad. And that's what we find here with Jezebel, and I think honestly throughout history. Keep in mind this, that you got the golden calf, which is monotheistic, and then what Jezebel does is wants to get Israel to worship the god of Phoenicia, which was Baal. And so that's what they were doing. You worship Jehovah plus Baal, and she's pushing to get rid of the servants of Jehovah and had many of them killed, if you remember. And so she's just really bringing havoc in the land. And then, sadly, people want to forsake Jehovah completely and only worship foreign gods. And that's where God, what do you do? And so who does he send in to try to get everybody's attention to kind of do something before it's too late? Elijah and Elisha, the great miracle workers. And so some of the greatest accounts in all the Bible are from this.
Troubler of this earth.
Yes, that's what Ahab called Elijah when he simply pointed out his sin. And we're going to talk about that tonight, the Lord willing. So, before we talk about this fascinating pair, I can't help but think about Galatians 6, 7 through 9. Wonderful spiritual principle. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction. The one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. The actual word here in the Greek is the word for putrefaction. And so the idea is, if you sow to the flesh and all you care is about fleshly things, and you want to know how that's going to work out for you eventually, just look in the casket after the body has had time to begin to putrefy. Very few things more smelly and more unpleasant to think of than a putrefying body. And he says that's what's going to happen to people. If all you care about is the flesh, then all you have are things of the flesh to look forward to, and ultimately destruction. But if you sow to the things of the Spirit, your spirit leaves the body and you get glorified and you have a spiritual inheritance for the rest of your existence. And so this is a time when the kingdom is sowing to the flesh. And when it mentions the Baal and the Asherim, that's the female counterpart of Baal. So remember, this was ultimately a sex cult. And people would go in to worship Baal and the Asherim, and they basically would have sex in these supposed sacred places where you worship Baal. And the idea is you would satisfy the desires of these pagan gods, which were in their minds carnal. And if you please them, then they would bless you. And so we think of religious people as being holy, but religious pagans were all wrapped up in some sort of sex cult trying to please the gods that they saw as being carnal. And sadly, our nation as a whole is celebrating basically the sex cult of LGBTQ, which is all it is, and is just all wrapped up and focused on sex. That's what the pagans did. So this isn't evolution. This is devolution. We're living more and more in a pagan world, and in some ways we are dealing with the same kind of problems and pressures that ancient Israel did. because most of these worship ceremonies involved sexual fertility rites. And so don't forget that. Sometimes you read through this, you don't realize that's what's going on. They are really sowing to the flesh. And let's look at 1 Kings 21 and 22. I wish we could read more about this, but for sake of time, let's look together at this incident where Ahab covets Naboth's vineyard. And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel next to the palace of Ahab king of Samaria. And Ahab spake unto Naboth, saying, Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs. Apparently this was his hobby, because it is near unto my house. And I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it, or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the one worth of it in money. It almost kind of sounds like in our modern country, the state can come in under eminent domain, and they have to pay you some sort of financial compensation or give you something that you will accept in trade. And so that's what Ahab's doing here, which initially sounds, reasonable. But Naboth said to Ahab, Jehovah forbid me. So there are people who are still caring about what Jehovah says. I can't give this to the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. So I don't care how much you pay me or what you try to trade me for this vineyard. This is a part of my tribal inheritance. Now remember, we talked about this when Joshua had the whole last half of the book of Joshua explaining all these land grants and how they were given according to lot by God's providential hand to these different tribes in Israel. And you could rent out your land to somebody from another tribe, but you weren't supposed to sell it. And if you lost it in some sort of foreclosure because you leaned money against it, there was a jubilee and a way to get it back or to redeem it. So this guy says, I'm a servant of Jehovah. You are not from my tribe. I'm sorry, I can't do this. This is against God's law. Well, of course, Ahab is upset with God's law here as well as with Naboth, especially, I think, because Naboth here is a good, godly man. And Ahab came into his house heavy and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he had said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. And he laid down upon his bed and turned away his face and would eat no bread. So what's he really doing here? Yes, he goes home, he's the king, and he pouts because he can't have this vineyard that he wants. And he must have felt mistreated. I'm the king and I offered to pay him for it, and he still won't do it. So here he's kind of whining. Enter Jezebel. Verse 5, but Jezebel his wife came to him and said unto him, Why is thy spirit so sad that thou eatest no bread? And he said unto her, Because I spake unto Naboth the Jezreelite, and I offered to give him thy vineyard for money, or else if it please thee, I will give him another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give thee my vineyard. Of course, he didn't explain the religious conviction that would cause him to do that. And Jezebel his wife said unto him, Dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let thy heart be merry. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. Don't worry, honey, I've got this covered. Now I want you to notice, Ahab doesn't ask her, how are you going to do this? He just says, you do your thing. Because he knows how wicked to the core she is. It's really interesting. Ahab is this character that has just enough religion to make him miserable. Just enough conscience to bother him and not want to do really wicked things out in the open. But he's glad to live off the nefarious deeds of other people and kind of turn his head and be the beneficiary with sort of plausible deniability. I didn't know anything about this. And so Ahab is particularly despicable because he's hiding behind the evil deeds of his wife. Many people prefer Jezebel over Ahab because at least she makes no bones about who she is. At least she's not trying to be more interested in looking good than being good. She didn't even care about looking good. She's wicked. Everybody knows she's wicked. She makes no bones about it. She's immoral. She's a murderer. She's an opportunist, but at least she makes no false pretenses. So that's kind of interesting, this dynamic here. And, if somebody's really wicked, at least if they're honest about who they are, you can deal with that better than somebody who is really wicked but wants to kind of be a wolf in sheep's clothing. So here's her plan. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. That's what Les was talking about. So this would have been one of those stamps that you put in wax, and it would indicate this comes from the king, this is royalty, and sent letters unto the elders and to the nobles that were in the city and that dwell with Naboth. Now notice what she does here. It shows a shrewd, conniving sort of understanding of human nature. And she wrote in the letter saying, proclaim a fast and set Naboth on high among the people. All right. So the people are going to do this. All of a sudden, we're going to honor Naboth. And we're going to have a special day, Naboth Day. And everybody's going to, honor him. What does that often do when somebody is esteemed and looked up to and honored, and you're not? Well, it causes people to be jealous, doesn't it? It causes people to think, well, he's not so great. Why is everybody making a fuss over him? Well, I know this, or this about this person. So Jezebel knows that just out of the blue, setting up this, big celebration for Naboth at the king's order is going to cause a lot of question and probably a lot of jealousy, and cause them to be more likely to believe the lies that she is going to set up against him. And then she says, after you set Naboth up, set 2 men, base fellows, before him, and let them bear witness against him. Now, why'd they do 2 men? Yeah, because the mouth of 2 or more witnesses, the thing shall be established. So you got 2 people to lie about Naboth and claim that they saw him cursing God and being guilty of blasphemy. Now, I think if this had come out just out of the blue, the townspeople probably would have defended Naboth, saying, I know this man's character. I find this very unlikely. You're not a reputable witness. But because they had jealousy within them, and they were upset with this, then Jezebel knew they're more likely to believe it. And so sure enough, they carried him out and stoned him to death for blasphemy. So Jezebel gets her way. And so verse 14, then they sent to Jezebel, the people of Jezreel, Naboth is stoned and is dead. Do you notice anything unusual about the way the people who carried out this order phrased this? I mean, would it have been appropriate to say, we set Naboth up and got him murdered as you requested? That's what happened. But they act like, oh, guess what? News alert. Naboth was stoned and is dead, as if it just kind of happened by accident when they set him up. Yes, Les.
How did the city elders know it was Jezebel and not Ahab? Because there was a letter from Ahab, sealed and everything, and yet, they sent word, and in here, they sent word to Jezebel that he was dead.
Yeah, well, maybe they knew that she was behind it, or maybe she's kind of more pulling the strings here than it appears to meet the eye. I don't know, but at any rate, Jezebel got word that her plan worked, and maybe it actually came from Jezebel, but because she had the king's seal, it had the authority of the king behind her words. That's probably the way to look at this.
And they had the 2 scoundrels.
Yeah, the 2 base men that lied. And so you got this good man who stood up for what was right, and what does it do? It cost him his life.
How about Naboth's sons? Would Wouldn't they inherit the front land?
Well, in this case, if Naboth isn't around, he's the king. He just comes in and seizes it. Like, what were you telling me your study Bible said?
Yeah, 2 Kings 9 and verse 26 says that Ahab had his sons killed.
So they wouldn't have any claim to this vineyard. Yes.
I think it's funny that it says worthless men, and it makes me wonder if that's how she wrote it too. Just find two just worthless men, and how they go about finding two worthless men is up to them. I don't know what they would have done. Like, hey, you willing to just lie? Sure, I'm kind of bored. Okay, great. You know,
Well, people who had a reputation, they probably bribed them to just say whatever needs to be said. Yeah, okay, thank you, Les. That's a good point. And it came to pass when Jezebel heard that Naboth was stoned and was dead, that Jezebel said to Ahab, "Arise and take possession of the vineyard of the Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give thee for money, for Naboth is not alive but dead." So Ahab apparently has no idea of this backstory. And it came to pass when Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, that Ahab rose up to go down to the vineyard of Naboth and to take possession of it. But of course, people do things behind the scenes, but who sees all? God. And so he sends Elijah, who's the prophet of that day. The word of Jehovah came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, "Arise, go down to meet Ahab king of Israel, who dwelleth in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, whether he is gone down to take possession of it. And thou shalt speak unto him, saying," so here he is all giddy and excited that he can go down there and take this possession. And you might say Elijah pours, water on his parade big time. "Thus saith Jehovah, hast thou killed and also taken possession?" Now, did Ahab personally kill? No, even Jezebel didn't personally kill, but he did this with his authority and manipulated the townspeople to do their evil deed. "And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith Jehovah, in the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick thy blood, even thine." So, wow, so he's going to have his own blood shed in the same place where Naboth's innocent blood was shed. Punishment fits the crime, doesn't it? Poetic justice. Now, verse 20, "And Ahab said to Elijah," this is what Todd was referring to, "Hast thou found me, O mine enemy?" Here he is whining again. "And he answered, I have found thee because thou hast sold thyself to do that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah. Behold, I will bring evil upon thee and will utterly sweep thee away and will cut off from Ahab every man-child and him that is shut up." So he's going to lose his dynasty just like Jeroboam and Baasha did in verse 22. And notice what he says about Jezebel. "And of Jezebel also spake Jehovah, saying, The dog shall eat Jezebel by the rampart of Jezreel. Him that dieth of Ahab in the city, the dog shall eat, and him that dieth in the field shall the birds of the heavens eat. There was none likened unto Ahab, who did sell himself to do that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah. And Jezebel had stirred him up. And he did very abominably in following idols, according to all that the Amorites did, whom Jehovah cast out before the children of Israel." So let's talk about this for just a minute. In 1 Kings 18, 17 and 18, we have another time where Elijah is confronting Ahab. And it says, "And it came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said unto him, Is it thou, thou troubler of Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, in that ye have forgotten the commandments of Jehovah, and thou hast followed after the Baalim." And so then they have this challenge where they go up on Mount Carmel, and the 400 prophets of Baal are destroyed, and Elijah has this great victory. Fire comes down from heaven, and you know the rest of the story. But I just think it's fascinating. Elijah is simply following God's care in calling out Elijah and Jezebel for their heinous sins. And basically, if they had followed what Elijah had said, God could have relented from a lot of these curses that are going to come upon him and saved the house of Ahab and saved Israel. So is Elijah the enemy here, or is he really the friend? I mean, he's giving tough love. He's telling it like it is, and yet he says, oh no, here's my enemy again. Just fascinating that he's considering the prophet the enemy when he's just doing the right thing. Has that ever happened today? And who's the troubler? The one that brings trouble to Israel is Ahab and Jezebel. But here he says the troubler of Israel is the one who points out the sin. How many times does somebody stand up against immorality and it's like they're the bigot, they're filled with hate, it's their problem. They're just calling out things the way they are. Yes, Anil.
I can't help but draw attention to John the Baptist in the New Testament,
Yes.
where Herod's wife, our daughter, is prompted by her mother, and she asked John the Baptist's head in the platter.
Yes.
And born out of a woman, there's none greater than John the Baptist, of course,
Right.
after Jesus Christ. So does she come close to being equal to Jezebel, or also the king stays silent there, and here the king stays silent?
Yeah, excellent parallel. And John the Baptist was just a powerful repent or burn kind of preacher. In fact, many people say that, that John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah. So they're definitely very similar. The other thing that I find amazing about Ahab that you wouldn't find about Jezebel. And it came to pass, verse 27, when Ahab heard those words, that he rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his flesh and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went softly. And the word of Jehovah came to Elijah, saying, seest thou how Ahab humbleth himself before me? Because he humbleth himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but in his son's days will I bring the evil upon his house. So the curse and the loss of his dynasty is going to be postponed because of a little time where he showed God respect and showed some humility. Now, please notice, he doesn't really repent. I mean, in the sense of he's going to stop all of his sinning. He's going to deal with the idolatry in the land. He's going to get rid of the calf worship. He doesn't do any of that. But just shows you how when you humble yourself before the hand of Jehovah, that he will lift you up. I just find this fascinating, that God still was touched by his humility, even though clearly there wasn't full repentance going on here. Yes, Todd.
Well, just to piggyback what Neil said, I think of Paul in his defenses. Felix called him a real pest, a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews, a ringleader. So he's all these things, and then Jesus himself is called a gluttonous man, and a drunkard, a friend of tax gatherers, etc. So when righteous people say truth, that's how evil people react. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And those who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution because you're the light, and when you shed light on darkness, people don't like it, right? All right, we've only got a couple of minutes. Chapter 22 is really interesting. Ahab and Jehoshaphat, who, by the way, is a good king, are up together in Samaria because they have this alliance. Remember, there's going to be the marriage of Ahab and Jezebel's daughter to the house, to Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram. So, at any rate, they decide that they want to go up to Ramoth Gilead, which is a city off near Syria of Damascus that should have been a part of Israel's territory, but the Syrians of Damascus had taken that particular city. And so they decided, let's go back up and let's reclaim our territory that the Syrians of Damascus took from us. But before they do so, they want to, get the approval of their prophets. So they have 400 prophets here that basically say, yes, go up and you'll prosper. And Jehoshaphat, who is a man of God, flawed, of course, but a man of God, he says, do you have a real prophet here other than these yes men? And this is interesting. And the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, there is yet one man by whom we may inquire of Jehovah, Micaiah, the son of Imlah. But I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. This guy tell you the truth, but I hate him because he tells me things I don't want to hear. So he's in prison. So Jehoshaphat says, well, I want to hear what he has to say here before I go up into battle. And so Micaiah basically says, no, you do this, you're going to be defeated, and the sheep are going to be scattered, and it's going to be a disaster. And he does something to try to trick God. Oh, I can't believe that's the bell already. He says, okay, I want you to put him in prison, and this time just, with just the bare minimum, and keep him there until I come back victorious. As if he can trick God and assume that God's going to protect his prophet, and therefore I can manipulate him. Pagans think that way. Pagans manipulate the gods with spells and potions in a way to get them to do their bidding. And so here they are mocking God. Of course, in the end, he winds up getting killed. And guess what happens? It says, and the blood ran out, this is verse 35, of the wound into the bottom of the chariot, and there went a cry throughout the host about the going down of the sun, saying, every man to his city and every man to his country. So Ahab the shepherd is killed, and the sheep are scattered. And the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried the king in Samaria, and they washed the chariot by the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood where the harlots wash themselves. So it's an unclean place, according unto the word of Jehovah which he spake. So this is near where Naboth's vineyard was. And so this is how God providentially brought about Ahab's demise. And then later on, we'll study next time, something similar happened to Jezebel. She gets thrown out this window, and she didn't even get a burial. Her flesh, and it happens right in the spot where Naboth's vineyard was. So, be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever you sow, you're going to reap. And these people sowed to the flesh, and they wound up reaping according to the flesh. So, amazing stories here, wonderful lessons. I want us to talk next week about Elijah, the bread of life. And I have a lot of scriptures for you to read before you come to class so we can really understand the mission of Elijah the prophet. And we'll have some class time to discuss what personal lessons we can have about how all these dynamics fit together. Thank you so much.